Survivors, students, and supporters demand action as they march for their lives across the United States. But will these mass protests lead to a change in legislation? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmakers are America's rallies against guns. Well, they're not old enough to vote, but they're definitely making their voices heard. Over the weekend, hundreds of thousands of demonstrators marched on Washington to demand stricter gun laws. It was one of the largest student-led protests since the Vietnam War, led by survivors of last month's school shooting in Parkland, Florida, where 17 people were killed. So far this year, more than 3,000 people have lost their lives to gun violence. But the U.S. gun lobby is one of the country's most influential, with a number of politicians relying on its funding. So will any march or any numbers change U.S. gun laws? That debate in a moment. But first, here's Christine Perovolakis.
Hundreds of thousands march for gun control across America.
My generation, having spent our entire lives seeing mass shooting after mass shooting, has learned that our voices are powerful and our votes matter.
Thousands more rallied from every corner of the globe. There are more firearms than there are people in the U.S. In 2017, there were 346 mass shootings, and there have been 49 this year alone. So why hasn't Washington done more to address gun violence? There are several reasons, ranging from deep divides between Republicans and Democrats, to gun owner activism, to perhaps the biggest hurdle of them all, the National Rifle Association, or NRA. It's pumped millions into the political campaigns of politicians.
When you have elected officials who feel that getting a few extra dollars from the NRA is more important than their actual constituents, you have gun violence.
And in return, the NRA makes sure gun owners can carry weapons anywhere. "19 school shootings took place in just 20 days in America. That's nearly one every day. Students said enough was enough after the Parkland massacre on Valentine's Day, which killed 14 high school students and 3 staff, sparking a nationwide movement to clamp down on guns.
Since the time that I came out here, it has been 6 minutes and 20 seconds. The shooter has ceased shooting and will soon abandon his rifle, blend in with the students as they escape, and walk free for an hour before arrest. Fight for your lives before it's someone else's job."
Americans have demanded change before, after Orlando, after Sandy Hook.
The majority of those who died today were children. Beautiful little kids between the ages of 5 and 10 years old.
Students say thoughts and prayers are not enough. They want to see change through stricter gun laws. But do gun laws work? Studies show gun-related deaths are lower in states such as New York, Connecticut, or Massachusetts, which have some of the toughest gun laws in the country. In fact, deaths are more than 4 times higher in states like Texas, Florida, and North Carolina, where guns are easily obtained. Now students are setting their sights on federal action. Florida has just raised the age from 18 to 21 to buy an assault weapon. And the White House says it will make schools more secure by arming teachers.
This is what democracy looks like!
But students don't all agree that's the solution. They're calling for a ban on assault weapons and background checks on every gun purchased. But with the right to bear arms enshrined in the Constitution's Second Amendment, is a march to save lives enough to get Congress to act? Christine Perovolakis, The Newsmakers.
Well, to discuss this further, we're joined now by Erica Ford. She is the CEO and founder of Life Camp Incorporated, a nonprofit organization working with communities impacted by gun violence. In the Mexican city of San Miguel de Allende, we have Larry Barton. He's an instructor at the FBI Academy and the U.S. Marshals Service. And completing our panel from Valley View, Texas, is political commentator and radio talk show host John Gibson. Thanks all so much for joining us. Let me begin with Erica. I'm just going to ask you, do you think this movement is genuinely making a difference, or do you fear it will fade away as the outrage has before with so many gun massacres?
Well, someone who sits here from 30 years of dedication to eradicating gun violence, I say that it is a spark that is lighting another Erica Ford, and that as I am here 30 years later, still dedicated, still making phenomenal changes and advancements and reduction of violence as we did here in New York City with the creation of the New York City Crisis Management System, I feel that the spark that lit so many lives on Saturday will be a continual fire that will burn and change the conditions of our children and as it relates to gun violence in the United States and across the world.
Okay. Larry Barton, is it different this time?
I think so. I think part of the issue here is that we're beginning to see a genuine dialogue that's not led just by adults. The fact that high school students have been able to reach to all levels of society and say this must stop is a huge step forward. It's no longer just a corporate issue or a civil rights issue or a human rights issue. This is about life at its best. And I do believe it's the beginning of what we saw with the civil rights movement and with many other movements in the U.S. I'm encouraged, but there's much more that has to be done.
John Gibson, from what I can see here, you're not feeling the momentum of these protests. In fact, you find them somewhat irritating in a way that might actually backfire.
It's a little tedious to have 16-year-olds telling us what to do, who apparently have not learned from civics class about the Constitution. It's very hard to change the U.S. Constitution. There is a Second Amendment. Now, as far as, other kinds of limitations on people getting guns, that probably will happen. I'm not saying this is going to come to nothing. But on the other hand, I think that the kids involved here, first of all, they're holding a special status that seems like it's impossible to criticize them without being shouted down. But I don't think they are going to get exactly what they want. I'm sure there will be some new kind of gun limitation laws, but I'm quite sure it's going to fall very short of what they've been demanding over the weekend.
I mean, John, you say they don't really understand the Constitution, they don't understand the Second Amendment, but then explain to us. I mean, the word amendment means change. The Constitution, as originally written, had to change at some point. Why should this movement not reflect on whether that change is appropriate today in 2018? And the Supreme Court can perhaps look at it again.
You just have to remember what has to happen for an amendment, something to change in the Constitution. It needs 3/4 of the state legislatures. It's very hard. It needs it needs a supermajority in the U.S. Congress. It's true there have been amendments to the Constitution. We can see them all there. I'm just suggesting what I'm hearing from people like David Hogg and others of the students from Parkland. They're demanding stuff that I think is going to be very, very difficult to change in the U.S. Constitution.
Okay, but they're also saying your right to bear arms, as per the Constitution, does not override our right to live. Let me ask you then point blank, do you think change should take place somehow? Something about gun legislation has to change? And if so, what would be your ideal legislation? What would be the balance between what these students are calling for and what you think would suffice for the Second Amendment rights?
You're asking my opinion. My opinion is that a person like David Hogg, Nicholas Cruz, should not have had that gun. He should not have been able to buy it.
Okay, so what would have stopped him from buying it?
If they had actually taken him into an involuntary confinement, he would not have been allowed to buy a gun. And by the way, there's several steps along the way here where Nicholas Cruz should have been either taken into custody or subjected to a lot more scrutiny than he was. People seem to be ignoring the many failures on... If he had been the deputy who did not go into the school to fire back at him, had an opportunity at one point to make Nicholas Cruz go to a mental institution. If he had done that, he would not have been able to buy that gun. He would have been forbidden from buying that gun, and he should have been forbidden from buying that gun.
Larry, I saw you had something to say. I'll let you jump in quickly. Go ahead.
Well, I want to try to clarify. The U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to bear arms. John is absolutely right, and I don't think anyone is questioning that. But we have 265 million guns in the U.S., one for every adult. We have enough guns. Here's our problem. It's the automatic rifle, the AR-15 that was used, as you just heard John say, but not just there, but also in many other critical events across our country. An automatic rifle is not guaranteed by the U.S. Constitution. That is absolutely heinous.
It's
to
not
have
an
9
automatic
bullets per
rifle.
second.
It's not an automatic rifle. You're
that
misstating that.
There is no need for an automatic rifle in the hands of a civilian, number one.
Automatic
Number two, I think you
rifles
just
are
said
illegal in this country.
They're illegal, but they're everywhere, and they're used in mass events all over.
You're talking about a semi-automatic rifle. If you ban the AR-15 because it's a semi-automatic rifle, what are you going to do about the 100 million hunting rifles that are semi-automatic? Do people not realize that there are other guns other than the AR-15 that are semi-automatic?
We're getting into too many technicalities about these guns here. The bump stocks are also
and
on the market as well.
That is
Erica, go ahead.
You know, when we get into that is exactly what happens when you get into the conversation of particulars, that the general call is for people to live, you know, and so when we get into the particulars of what gun I have and if it's bigger and da-da-da-da-da-da, you know, then people are going to say, well, I got mines, and you get into particulars. Let's stay focused on the point that what are we going to, he had a point in terms of how do we deal with this question. We still have to also look at the mental health issue, because the program that we have, we work with shooters. We work with people who have the potential to shoot somebody, and so we change their mindset. We've put our full focus on the decisions that they make, how they make their decision, and stay on top of those people. So that if we were in Parkland, for example, we would have been working with that young man because he had a high risk of shooting someone.
There is a very serious constitutional issue here, and we've heard President Trump say this is really a question about mental fitness and mental illness.
There's a constitutional issue.
Let me ask you this specifically, though. When you hear legislators talking about legislation that would prevent mentally ill people from getting firearms, you can't do that by the Constitution, because the Constitution cannot discriminate against people with mental illness. Someone who suffers from depression that perhaps takes antidepressants has just as much of a right to defend himself and bear arms as, say, anyone that we would deem mentally fit. How do you address that? It seems like this legislation will either have to be all or nothing. Going back to what Larry was saying, the Constitution does not provide for semi-automatic and automatic weapons, Larry.
We can't legislate our way out of this issue. We cannot legislate our way out of this issue. There are various things that have to happen in the United States to deal with the violence issue, to deal with the gun violence issue. New York City is a heavy legislated city, and we still have people who kill people. It is more than the laws, and it is the work that has to be done both on the ground and in the legislative chambers that will change the condition of violence in America.
Okay, Larry, go ahead.
We have had a national mantra, Angela, which says, and Eric, I think you'd agree, and John would as well, if you see something, say something. If you see someone who is mentally ill, if they are talking on Facebook or on a post about injuring others, speak up. Well, guess what? 23 people spoke up, at least in Parkland. And Erica is right. The mental health system has failed. No one intervened. That sentence, if you say something, lost its credibility because no one could connect the dots. We need to rewrite our laws, and we need a social cause which says, as to John's point, if you need to hunt, we respect that. If you need a private weapon to protect your home, we understand that. But we have to address mental health that is out of control and not getting the treatment, and law enforcement agencies that are not allowed to talk with one another, let alone the treater of those who have said, I will kill. The fact that we have people from talking to one another, psychologists, psychiatrists, school counselors, principals, parents, the fact that this is a total vacuum, that we cannot connect the dots, is a huge social dilemma that we must face.
John, if we can, I'd like to talk about that kind of better case scenario you mentioned before, whereby you said the deputy in Parkland took off. He didn't go in and do his job to better protect those students. You know, I remember, and you'll be very familiar, I assume, with the Sutherland Springs church shooting, in which the neighbor came to the rescue of some of the parishioners that were there, and he was hailed as a hero for saving a number of lives. When you saw the interview with him later, and he broke down and cried and said, "I'm not a hero. I didn't get to save these people. Too many people died. These were my neighbors that got shot." And in the end, he was deeply traumatized by having to take another human life and not getting there in time. Is that the best case scenario when you have more arms around to try and protect innocent people, that you leave someone with the mental trauma of having to shoot another human being and come to the rescue and still see innocent people die?
Yeah, it is. It's the price of it. Look, you know, we keep talking about, and I'm sorry, this was not an automatic weapon. Automatic weapons are not allowed, even under the U.S. Constitution. It's a semi-automatic weapon. If people say, look, we don't want this AR-15, fine. You know, you ban it. Who cares? But I can tell you this. They're then going to discover there are millions and millions and millions other semi-automatic weapons out there. And the first time a kid brings a deer rifle to school and shoots somebody, they're going to say, "Wait a minute, we didn't know there are more semi-automatics out there." The answer here is to protect the school from anyone, crazy person coming in with a gun. And not to say to 100 million people, there are 36 million people in this country who have hunting licenses, who all probably own 2 or 3 guns apiece. I'm not seeing here anybody offering any kind of answer. What are you going to do about that? What clearly ought to happen here is that somebody who's had mental issues like Nicholas Cruz should not be allowed to buy a gun. I'm perfectly fine. I think a lot of other people are perfectly fine with that limitation. But if you're going to try to say, all right, 40, 50, 60 million people who have guns, please turn them in, I'm just suggesting to you that's not going to work.
But Erica, let me ask you, is that what you think we need to see? Does there need to be something broader here, like an amnesty? We need to get the 300 million estimated guns in the U.S. reined into a point where only people who are responsible enough to carry them and only those non-automatic weapons are out there?
I remember a time when that did happen, where they called for people to turn in their guns on a national level after the war, because I remember my father, who was killed in the Vietnam War, my mother had to go turn in his guns. So, I mean, it is something that can happen, but there's no one nothing that fits the resolution of violence in America. It is a health issue. It is a legislative issue. It is a people's issue, and we all have to work together to move forward on getting guns out of the hands that people who don't need them, keeping them safe in our houses, and changing the mindset of those people who do use gun as a resolution to their interpersonal problem, and make them put it down. You know, you talked about the officer who was impacted by fear, as well as the young man who went into that school that was impacted. That was 2 plain examples of people with guns, and they were both scared. One didn't use it, one used it. And so now, how do we move? That's both sides of the equation. Now, we have to help people heal. We have to help change mindsets. We have to make guns safe in our homes, because nobody, if this man who is talking, or anybody on this show, or anybody that has guns in their house, if their children were in a room and their wife was in a room and somebody walked in with the most high-tech semi-automatic or a little handgun, which one would they want their children to be? They might have a safer chance of knocking that person out with that handgun as they would with that semi-automatic, who might shoot all of them in one swift. You know, so it's just relative to you at the time of your intersection with that incident of violence. And we have to make our people safe, both mentally and physically.
Okay. Larry, can I ask you this? Why, as in most other developed countries on the planet, the military and the police are trusted to protect the public? And generally, they do a pretty good job of that. Why is that not enough for Americans?
Well, I think first, because back to the original point, our Constitution, created by people who were fleeing largely Great Britain, said you should have the right to bear arms so that you are able to fight yourself against the government if you ever were fighting a tyrannical state. That is virtually word for word what the argument was. And again, back to this, what was a weapon then is obviously quite different 250 years later. We're mincing words. An automatic weapon, a semi-automatic weapon. The point is a pistol or a rifle that may be used legally by smart people that have been well vetted is totally appropriate. I've never met anyone who says that they do not believe in that.
We only have a few.
The issue is that a semi-automatic or an automatic weapon does not belong in the hands of a civilian. That's where the military should be protecting all of us.
Okay, and there's also a huge issue here. We only have a couple minutes left to look at. Is this the kind of financial damage that this could do to gun manufacturers in the United States? It's an absolutely huge industry. It employs over 300,000 people alone. If we are to cut back on the kinds of massive arms sales we see in the United States, John Gibson, let me ask you, what would happen then to the people in the gun industry in the U.S.?
Look, Remington is declaring bankruptcy today. I mean, that's already happening. The financial penalties that result to gun manufacturers and sales organizations from something like this is already happening. But all you have to do is suggest that you're going to ban these weapons. You're going to say, all right, well, no more semi-automatic weapons. And immediately there's a run on guns like no one has ever seen. That doesn't really solve the problem. If you want to focus on people who shouldn't have guns, go ahead. But leave the people alone who don't do anyone any harm with their guns.
Erica, let me ask you, what do you think you, as a gun control activist, are really up against here when you're looking at this multi-billion-dollar industry and extremely powerful gun lobbyists? How are you ever going to not change? How would you ever turn the gun industry into what the tobacco industry in the U.S. became?
I don't think that that's a real issue. The other number that I want to look at is that black men are 13 times more likely to get shot by a gun, that 1 in 3 homes with children have guns in them. Most of them are unlocked and or loaded. And so we need to protect our children. That is our only responsibility. It's not about dollars.
We understood, but there's an economic issue here, Erica. This is a gigantic industry with extremely powerful lobbyists.
The economic issue for black people is the prison industrial complex that criminalizes our children and shoots them every single day. Mass shootings that we're talking about is something that happens in the same way it happened with the tobacco industry, it can happen with the gun industry. There's no absolutes in this world. Okay. And so I'm just saying that as we talk about this, we can't be a voice of people who are not heard and not looked at, who are mostly impacted by gun violence in America,
right, Erica,
whether it's the police shooting them or...
It branches out into so many areas, and it is extremely tragic. But Larry, I just want to finish with you then. When I talk about, the demise, really, of the tobacco industry, big tobacco was extremely powerful in the United States. It has diminished incredibly. Do you think the same could possibly happen with the gun industry when lobbyists and the NRA are finally criticized to the point that they no longer have what they used to have?
The question you've asked is, are guns integral to the U.S. economy? And the answer is no. They're not a powerful, huge part of our gross economic product.
But the gun lobby is.
But the gun lobby is. Thank you. That's exactly the issue. What the NRA needs to do as an advocacy group is to acknowledge that there is a problem with guns. We have a problem with mentally ill people who can get easy access, in some states, same day, to automatic and semi-automatic and handguns. That is wrong. The NRA needs to modify and begin this dialogue, as you suggested, with the tobacco industry. Eventually, the tobacco companies are still around. They're still making money. They've diversified into the wine and other industries. It's not as if they went out of business. This is an economic issue, it's a social issue, and it is a mental health issue. And until we get the NRA to embrace some change and get off their perch and say they're willing to work with smart people, with civilians on the street, with the minority communities, until the NRA is willing to modify, we're at a loggerhead.
Okay. John Gibson, quick final word.
There was no constitutional amendment protecting tobacco. It's just completely different. And to suggest they're more or less the same is to live in la-la land. You have to deal with the fact that this is a constitutional amendment. There are ways to change it, but it is very difficult, and you cannot be
so
radical
innocent people
in your
will have
approach.
to continue to die.
Look, if you go ahead, try to change the Constitution. It's a hard thing to do.
I would still be a slave if we didn't change the Constitution.
Yeah, and guess what? It took a civil war. So I don't think anybody's looking for a civil war to overturn the Second Amendment.
Times is different. Times is different.
They're not that different. And if you want to try it, good luck. But you know what the constitutional hurdles are, and don't pretend like they're not there.
Okay. Can we all agree on one thing? A mental health challenge needs to be addressed. Can we
Larry,
all agree on that? Yes, please.
Right. We'll have to leave it there.
Exactly.
I'd like to thank all three of our panelists so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. Erica Ford, Larry Barton, John Gibson, thank you. Still to come, from the U.S. to the U.K. to Kenya and India, we ask, has Cambridge Analytica brought people to power? And have we just seen the tip of the iceberg from the massive Facebook data breach? Plus, will the Afghan government and the Taliban ever sit at the same table? As the latest peace initiative gets underway, we speak to a member of the Afghan royal family. Well, during the 2016 U.S. presidential election campaign, some members of the media called Cambridge Analytica Donald Trump's secret weapon. But now the UK consultancy firm is in hot water for using the data of some 50 million users to influence votes. Now, many Facebook users are up in arms over whether they can trust the social networking site with their information. For more, here's Randolph Nogel.
Our next focus is building community. We've always done a lot of work to help people share and get a diversity of opinions out there. And we're always going to do this. But now, in addition, we're also going to work on building common ground.
It was a pledge made just a few months after U.S. President Donald Trump was sworn into office. A divisive figure with a penchant for social media, Trump himself would inaugurate so-called fake news as a prominent fixture of the modern political landscape.
Fake news, media, or press.
Now, revelations have emerged that a data analytics firm used personal information harvested from more than 50 million Facebook profiles for political ends, including targeting American voters.
That data is out there. There's a marketplace for your data. It's bought and sold every day. Here's the point. The progressive left and the opposition party cannot get over one basic fact. Donald J. Trump is president of the United States, and he beat Hillary Clinton. He beat her badly.
But the uproar is mainly focused on how Facebook users' personal information was used by Cambridge Analytica to manipulate their political persuasions.
We were involved in the Trump campaign, as I've made clear, for very many months now. We managed everything from research to data to analytics to all the digital marketing to also the television marketing that was undertaken.
In an undercover report by Britain's Channel 4, Chief Executive Officer Alexander Nix was filmed discussing how to produce sex scandals and fake news to skew elections around the world.
Sent some girls around to the candidate's house.
He has since been suspended from the company.
Lots of history of things.
In elections past, one of the usual phenomena or characteristics of elections is people give wrong information over other candidates to outdo them. And those can be just from hurling insults to hate speech or to defaming them. In the 2017 elections was where we saw something totally different.
Scaremongering tactics were evident in the election of Uhuru Kenyatta over his opponent, Raila Odinga. And by Cambridge Analytica's own admission, it was involved in just about every element of Kenyatta's re-election bid. But the contested vote is not the only one being re-examined in light of the revelations about the breach of Facebook users' data. Investigators from Britain's data watchdog have raided Cambridge Analytica's London offices. They wanted to find out whether the company provided data to the Vote Leave campaign ahead of the 2016 Brexit referendum. But what's most troubling for lawmakers isn't if and how Cambridge Analytica manipulated political choices, but how it got the data in the first place.
Look, these companies have grown very fast. Within the span of less than 10 years, they've gone from being a novel idea to a major corporation. And I'm not sure if the sort of institutional knowledge about the responsibilities, both legal and ethical, that come with that have kept pace with their growth.
The main U.S. consumer protection body has reportedly opened an investigation into whether Facebook has violated privacy agreements. And EU leaders have revisited the issue. A new EU General Data Protection Regulation, or GDPR, comes into effect in May, and it could cost Facebook and other companies significant portions of their annual revenue for such data breaches.
Cheating will be very, very expensive.
The question many are asking is if governments don't come to terms with how to better protect user data, who will?
Can Facebook cut all of this off? Can they actually go far enough to protect your privacy? Absolutely not, because their entire viability financially involves using data to create a good experience for you and to target you for ads. Without that, they don't have a business.
Or perhaps the onus will fall on the consumer to establish fact from fiction, to tell friend from foe. Randolph Nogel, The Newsmakers.
Well, joining me now from New York is Hamdan Azhar. He's a former data scientist at Facebook and the founder of the data journalism company Prismoji. And from Vilnius in Lithuania is Ian Mitchell, QC. He is the chairman of the Working Party on Surveillance for the European Federation of Bars, and he also sits on the Data Protection Working Party of the Bar of England and Wales. Thanks both so much for joining us. Hamdan, let me start with you. I would really appreciate if you could give me an example of how this actually works. It's, in the end, about this psychological manipulation, they're saying. A campaign that Cambridge Analytica is advising has your data on Facebook. What ads, tell us, does it actually put on the page, or what messages is it really sending you to so-called manipulate you or to perpetrate this mind hacking that we should all be so disturbed by?
Well, thank you, Andrea. It's great to be here. I think we have to understand the incentives that Cambridge Analytica has to exaggerate, honestly, their abilities to influence people's behavior using psychographic targeting. They are, at the end of the day, trying to say that they have all these incredible abilities so that they can get more clients and they can get more press, they can get free media coverage. Frankly, I think it's a bit exaggerated because the mechanics of how it works are pretty complicated. So they had this quiz on Facebook, this personality quiz developed by this researcher. So they have people responding to these personality questions, and they're trying to estimate their attributes on extroversion and neuroticism and agreeableness. And using these big 5 attributes, then they're trying to predict their political beliefs. So that's the first prediction. That's pretty hard. The accuracy of that model it hasn't been explained. It hasn't been described in the literature. In my experience, I think that's a pretty hard leap to do. And once they've modeled people's political behavior using these psychological attributes, then they have to target these people on Facebook. Now, targeting on Facebook is predominantly using likes, using the pages you've liked. So now that they know some people are neurotic and maybe they support Donald Trump, they have to find what are the pages people who support Donald Trump like on Facebook. You know, is it Alex Jones? Is it Fox News? And they have to target them on Facebook. So it all sounds pretty crude to me. I think, honestly, it's a bit far-fetched to assume, to imagine that they've successfully manipulated all these elections around the world. And I think we need to be quite skeptical of their claims and also recognize that we live in a world in which surveillance capitalism... Yes, go ahead.
Sure, then, I mean, what really is all the fuss all about?
Well, I think the fuss is about our data, is about who controls our data in the world, in a world in which we live in a world of surveillance capitalism, where the model that funds the internet is a model in which all of our behaviors and our activities on our computers and on our smartphones are monitored and logged to, minute detail so that advertisers can show us ads.
Okay.
That's the world in which we live, and it's a world in which big companies such as Facebook and Google and Apple control tremendous amounts of data about us. And people are concerned because we're just leaking all of this data out there, and big companies have this data, and what are they doing with it? I think that's the deep-seated concern that people have.
Okay.
And Facebook, prior to 2014, had a pretty liberal policy where they had this graph API, and developers could build apps on top of this API, and by building these apps, they could get data on people not only who are using these apps, but the friends of people who are using these apps. And that's a lot of data that's out there. Now, frankly, it is concerning. I just don't think the concerns that this was used to manipulate elections at a large scale are frankly justified, given the evidence we've seen so far.
It may be concerning, but Ian Mitchell, let me ask you, I mean, aren't marketers and advertisers simply adapting now to social media? I mean, before it was banks and credit card companies selling our data on to third companies that used to bombard us with telemarketing. Remember, we used to get phone calls at home. They used to stack our mailboxes with junk mail. They had our addresses because banks and credit card companies were selling on their data lists for profit. What's the difference?
Well, I think, as they say in France, plus ça change, plus c'est la même chose. The more things change, the more they stay the same. What's changing is, of course, the technology and the abilities. And I'm quite amused at the proposition, which is probably true, that it's extremely difficult to data mine and focus and manipulate opinion, but that isn't a good reason for why you should get away with trying to do it. I think the problem is that people feel that data mining is getting very intrusive. There is a sense in which we are our data. We leave digital footprints on the internet, and the digital footprint is almost a simulacrum of ourselves. So people feel very possessive about their data.
Okay, but they can't get everything for free. They want these social media sites for free. There's no such thing as a free lunch.
Yes, absolutely there's no such thing as a free lunch. And let me fess up. I have got a card that's issued by my local supermarket in the UK, and it's scanned every time I do my shopping. Now, I'm quite comfortable about the supermarket knowing what I buy and sending me tailored offers. I know that what I'm doing is helping them with their business model. It helps them refine and focus the sorts of goods they sell. It enables them to shift stuff to me. Because I know about it, I'm perfectly content for them to do it. But the issue is that people are going in to things like harmless little quizzes, as they think, on the internet. It is a social medium. They think that they're having a bit of harmless fun, and then they're taken aback when the news comes out, be it true or be it exaggerated, that in fact this material is being used for purposes that they had no idea it was being used for.
Okay, Ian, before I go back to Hamdan, then tell me, when does it actually cross the line from being good, creative campaigning to actually cheating and deception?
When people start telling lies, frankly.
But campaigning always does that.
When people start manipulating. No, I mean, for years before I got involved in seriously focusing on what I do now, I was quite heavily involved in politics in the UK. I ran for Parliament umpteen times, even ran for the European Parliament. And one thing that you can slant the news, you can give emphasis, but one thing I can say is that neither I nor any of my opponents told a mistruth, told an untruth. And of course, the whole point about, you think of the fake news, the Pope supports Donald Trump news that was one of the facetious examples. That's about telling people lies. And of course, you create a mechanism in which that propaganda can be focused and can feed in, operating with what psychologists call confirmation bias.
Okay, Hamdan, let me ask you, I mean, in all of this, does Facebook now have to take some responsibility for helping spread lies and fake news?
I think not only is the problem that mistruths are being spread on social networks, I think the problem, we have to call it by its name, is centralization. It's that why do we live in a world where a handful of big companies have all this power? That's why I think decentralization is a path forward. It's not just delete Facebook or Facebook has all this data. Why don't we have decentralized applications where people can control their own data, where there can be transparency around how that data is used and who has access to that data? And I think that's why I'm so excited about blockchain and decentralization. And that's what we're building at Zap.org, where people can control their data. We don't need a world where there's one giant company that runs the world's greatest social network and everyone is forced to use it because of network effects. I think we can envision a more open and transparent world where people have the power, not big corporations.
But that's great. But until that's done, is someone responsible for illegally giving access to data that users did not want given? Ian, go ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. In Europe, we've got the General Data Protection Regulation coming into effect in about 6 or 8 weeks' time, and we've already got pretty rigorous data protection laws. The whole idea being that people should have some sort of sense of autonomy over their data. Data shouldn't be misused under the existing law and under the new law as well. The key element is consent. What the GDPR is particularly strong on is the whole notion of informed consent. You should actually know specifically what your data is going to be used for and be given the opportunity to agree or not agree that it be used for those purposes. That's why I gave you my example of the supermarket. I'm very happy that they use my data because I know that they're only going to use it to flog me groceries, but I'm not at all happy that somebody is mining my data and going to start using me as a kind of a laboratory rat and manipulate the way my brain works.
Okay.
Very different thing altogether.
We'll have to see.
That's why we have data protection laws.
We'll have to see if legislation can keep up with this constantly changing technology. Ian Mitchell, I'll have to give you the last word. Thank you so much for joining us. Hamdan Azhar as well. Thank you both for being on the Newsmakers.
I call on the Taliban and their leadership. Today, the decision is in your hands. Accept peace, a dignified peace, and come together to safeguard this country, which has been a result of our sacrifices and struggle.
Well, since Ashraf Ghani made that plea to the Taliban, not much has really changed. Peace and security in Afghanistan remain a distant hope. In the past week alone, there's been an attack every second day, with around 45 people killed in separate bombings across the country. On Friday, a suicide bomber targeted a stadium in Helmand province, an area heavily dominated by the Taliban. So what can be done? Well, this week in the Uzbek capital, Tashkent, representatives from 25 countries are coming together to discuss a peace process for Afghanistan. Its main aim is to get the Taliban and Afghan government in direct negotiations. But the militant group will not accept Ghani's government, so what is the solution? Well, let's speak to someone with very close and personal ties to Afghanistan. Ali Seraj joins us from Washington. He is a member of the Afghan royal family and author of The Lost Kingdom, Memoir of an Afghan Prince. Thank you so much for joining us. I'd first like to get your perspective then on the talks that are underway in Tashkent. Do you hold out any hope that at least progress can be made toward peace?
You know, for the last 17 years, excuse me, for the last 17 years, we have been wasting our time. The Taliban are not a cohesive group of people led by one individual that you can sit down and negotiate. These are a group of killers that come from various parts of the world. They are Chechens, they are Xinjiang from China, they are the Lashkar-e-Taiba from Pakistan, you have got Arabs from the Middle East, you have got so many different groups. Now you have the ISIS and the Daesh. So who are you going to sit down and talk with? These people are not interested in talking. These people are interested in murder and mayhem. And when I hear the same thing over and over again, like a broken record, that we're going to sit down and talk peace with the Taliban. If the Taliban are so important and they're peace-loving people, why did we drive them out of Afghanistan in 2001? The reason we drove them is because of what they did. They were involved in Al-Qaeda, and the Taliban were involved in bringing down the World Trade Centers in New York. They've been involved in a lot of activities, murders, activities all over the world. So how can you sit down and negotiate peace with these people? They're not interested in peace.
I understand that, and I mean, the U.S. has always said it won't negotiate with terrorist groups. But after 17 years, as you've said, of time wasted, what other options are there?
The options, Madam, are Afghanistan is a tribal nation. It's a nation of tribes. Afghanistan was always defended and protected by its tribes, the tribal warriors. Your government, the Turkish government, knows this very well. My uncle, King Amanullah, who ruled Afghanistan from 1919 to 1929 and was very close associate of Kemal Atatürk, realized that Afghanistan needed economic development. Afghanistan needed unity. And it was the unity of Afghanistan that kept Afghanistan safe. Today, Afghanistan is no longer united. The tribes are all broken along ethnic groups because there's no central power in Afghanistan. So each group has gone around its own powerful leader. The Uzbeks are on Dostum, the Tajiks are on Atta, the Hazaras are around...
Right.
Yes.
And let's just put it out there. I mean, you've always said that Afghans do not respect policies, they respect a person. Afghanistan needs a strong man. So are you subscribing to a dictator for Afghanistan that can basically keep all these tribal elements under control?
No, madam. Dictatorship is not going to bring Afghanistan together. Afghanistan needs to go back to its old system. It's got to go back to the drawing board,
which was
of
a monarchy.
Tribal council. Afghanistan can, well, not necessarily the monarchy today, because of our family. I am first in line to the throne of my grandfather, but I'm in my 70s. Well, you know, what good can I bring to Afghanistan? What we can do as a family to bring the tribes together to create a tribal council, where the tribal council will decide the future of Afghanistan. For the last 40 years, the Afghan people have never been given the right to decide their own future. Programs and governments have been imposed upon Afghanistan over and over again, including the Karzai government, which was not elected but selected, and also the Ghani government, which was not elected, it was selected. So we have had selected governments, and we have governments imposed upon us. It is time that the world realized that Afghanistan is not America, Afghanistan is not France or Germany. Afghans are a very unique group of people. Their history goes back 5,000 years. For
but the
5,000 years,
strongman that you're
kept their own,
describing does not
independence.
give Afghans the right to choose a leader.
Who's that person? Any strongman that comes in and does not
Would you like to be that
then he's not
strongman?
the right person for Afghanistan. I'd like, members of my family would like to play a part in the unification of the tribes, so that the tribes are given the right to defend their, you know, come up with a solution for their own country, without having outsiders, you know, to dictate to us on how to live, and we cannot be built in the image of America or in the image of France or Germany or anywhere.
I understand
we are
that.
Afghans. We can only be built. Yeah.
But the problem was, I mean,
Go
prior
ahead,
to the Soviet invasion, when the monarchy was actually in power, you had, what, 18% literacy rates, for example? People were desperately, desperately poor, and many were desperately unhappy. That foments revolution as well, and it's, you can't, those people don't have free choice either.
That is not correct, madam. This book of mine, The Lost Kingdom for Tribes of Afghanistan, spells the entire, the golden years of Afghanistan and the bad years, the good, the bad, and the ugly in Afghanistan. At that time, we may have been poor because we have never, every time we have raised our head to move forward, they have come and hammered us on the head. This is very well known during the reign of my uncle, King Amanullah, during the 10 years that he was the king. And the first constitution written to give the women the right to vote was written in Afghanistan in 1921, where Queen Suraya was the author of that movement. We were
And
moving
you opened
in a very
Kabul's
good,
first nightclub
space.
as well.
I brought the revolution in Afghanistan. In 1970, I established the 25-hour club, which was a center for the East and West. Believe me, if Afghanistan was such a radical,
still many saw you catering
today,
to a minority elite, not to the masses.
It was to the masses. Not, I mean, anybody who could afford it. It was not inexpensive, but it was quite expensive for people to come there. It was not a place for the farmer from Herat to come and visit, because for those kind of people they had their own restaurants. This particular one was set up for the foreign community and for the elite within the government, where they could meet, mingle, and talk. And it was very, very important. Every sector of international community were there.
Okay, Prince Ali Seraj, very unfortunately we're out of time. I would like to thank you so much for joining us on this edition of The Newsmakers. That's all for this edition of The Newsmakers with me, Andrea Sankey. Remember, you can check out more of our stories on YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter. Remember to like, follow, and subscribe. Next time, Carles Puigdemont's arrest in Germany sparks protests. Will the former Catalan leader be sent back to Spain? Until then, thanks for watching. Goodbye.